Nobody noticed Ethan Carr. That was the whole point of him being there, or at least, that was what it felt like. 6 months ago, the human government had sent him to the crown world of Siluria as a military attaché, a fancy title for a meaningless job. He was supposed to observe, report, and represent humanity's growing presence in the Concord of Thrones, the massive galactic coalition of alien monarchies that ruled most of known space. In reality, he stood in hallways, he ate alone, he was ignored. Siluria was beautiful, he had to admit. The entire civilization existed on an ocean moon, and the royal palace was built beneath the waves, a glittering dome of living coral and bioluminescent stone, filled with water-filtered light that shifted from blue to gold depending on the hour. The Silurians themselves were tall, amphibian-like beings with smooth, pale skin that glowed faintly along their crests and jawlines. They moved with a grace that made Ethan feel like a stumbling child every time he walked among them. They were also, without exception, completely uninterested in him. Royal Guard was the worst. They were enormous, 7 feet tall on average, covered in natural bioarmor that hardened like bone along their shoulders, arms, and spines. Their guard commander, Lord Sathan, had made his feelings about Ethan clear on the very first day. He had looked down at the human with those wide, silver eyes and said, "You will stay out of the way. You will not touch our systems. You will not speak during briefings. You are here because your government asked and our queen is generous. Do not mistake generosity for respect." Ethan had nodded, "Understood, sir." That was the last time Sathan had spoken to him directly. His quarters were small, a converted storage room near the servants' wing, far from the royal chambers. His comm unit was locked out of the guard channels. His security clearance gave him access to public corridors and nothing else. He was, in every way that mattered, a decoration, a token, proof that the Silurian Dominion was open-minded enough to tolerate a human in their palace, even if they had no intention of actually using him. But Ethan was not the kind of man who sat still. In the first week, he memorized the patrol routes of the Royal Guard. In the second week, he learned the layout of the palace, not just the public areas but the service corridors, the maintenance shafts, the old emergency tunnels that predated the current security grid. By the end of the first month, he could navigate the palace blindfolded. By the end of the third month, he had taught himself conversational Silurian, not through the translator implant that every off-worlder used, but through study, repetition, and the patient help of a kitchen worker named Delin who found his pronunciation hilarious. He also noticed things. That was the problem with being invisible. People forgot you were there. Guards talked freely in front of him. Servants moved around him like he was furniture. Diplomats walked past without lowering their voices. And Ethan, trained in observation, trained in threat assessment, trained in the quiet, unglamorous work of military intelligence, watched and listened and remembered everything. He noticed that the sensor grid along the Eastern Service Corridor dropped coverage for 6 seconds every 40 minutes during a calibration cycle. He noticed that visiting diplomatic staff were screened at the main entrance but not rescreened when moving between palace wings. He noticed that 3 members of a Varkith trade delegation had been quietly replaced since their arrival, and no one had updated the guest registry. The Varkith made him nervous. They were a reptilian species, cold, sharp, and militaristic, who had been openly hostile to the upcoming treaty that would grant humans expanded rights within the Concord. Queen Valith herself was championing the treaty, using her political influence to push it through despite resistance. The Varkith saw it as a threat to their dominance. Ethan saw their trade delegation and felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He filed a report. It was thorough, 3 pages of observations, cross-referenced with sensor data he had scraped from public terminals, complete with a timeline of the personnel changes in the Varkith delegation. Lord Sathan's aide returned it unread. "The guard commander does not require input from the human attaché," the aide said, not unkindly. Our security protocols are more than adequate." Ethan took the report back. He folded it neatly and put it in his pocket. Then he went to the Hall of Tides, the massive ceremonial chamber beneath the ocean floor where the upcoming diplomatic summit would be held, and spent 2 hours walking its perimeter, measuring sight lines, identifying blind spots, and counting the seconds between guard positions. It was during one of these walks that he encountered Princess Elindra Sarai for the second time. She was younger than her mother, though young, for a Silurian still meant she had been alive for over a century. Her bioluminescence was brighter than most, a soft blue-white that pulsed along her cheekbones and down her throat when she was thinking. She carried herself with the stiff precision of someone who had been trained since birth to be watched. She stopped when she saw him. "You are the human." "Yes, Your Highness." "You are always walking these halls. Do they not bore you?" "Not particularly, Your Highness." She studied him with open curiosity, the way someone might study an unusual fish in a tank. "I have read about your species. You are fragile. You have no natural armor, no venom, no psionic ability. Your bones break easily. You live, what, 80 years? If we are lucky. Then why does your government send a soldier? What can one human do here that our guard cannot?" Ethan considered this. "Probably nothing, Your Highness." She blinked, surprised by the honesty. "Then why are you here?" "Because someone has to be, and I was available." She almost smiled at that. "Almost. A strange species," she murmured and walked away. Ethan watched her go, then turned back to the hall. He pulled out the folded report from his pocket, looked at it one more time and tucked it away. 3 days before the summit, he noticed new faces among the service staff, faces that didn't match the duty roster. He noticed a gap in the perimeter sensor logs that had been manually overwritten. He noticed a visiting diplomat's bodyguard carrying a sidearm with a power signature that didn't match standard diplomatic-class weapons. He filed another report. It was returned within the hour, again unread. This time, Lord Sathan sent a message directly. "We do not require the observations of a human. Attend to your duties and leave security to those equipped for it." Ethan sat in his small room that night. He stared at the ceiling, at the faint glow of bioluminescent coral veins running through the stone above his bed. He thought about the sensor gap. He thought about the new faces. He thought about the princess, standing in that hall, asking him what one human could do. He did not sleep. Instead, he pulled up a map of the Hall of Tides on his personal datapad and began marking positions, not patrol routes, not guard stations, but something else. Places where a single person, standing in the right spot at the right time, might see what no one else was looking for. Places where he could be useful. Because Ethan Carr had been ignored, dismissed, and underestimated his entire posting. But he had never, not once, stopped paying attention. And somewhere in the back of his mind, in the place where instinct lived, where training became reflex, something was telling him that the summit was going to go very, very wrong. He just didn't know yet how right he was. The Hall of Tides had never been so full. Over 400 delegates from across the Concord of Thrones filled the vast chamber, ambassadors, military advisors, trade ministers, and royalty from dozens of star systems. The dome above them was transparent, showing the dark ocean above, and schools of bioluminescent creatures drifted past like slow fireworks, casting shifting patterns of light across the gathered crowd. At the center of it all, on a raised dais of polished coral, Queen Valith Sarai IX stood beside her daughter. The queen was magnificent, nearly 8 feet tall, her bioluminescence burning a steady, regal gold along her crest. Princess Elindra stood to her left, dressed in ceremonial silks that shimmered like liquid mercury, her own light a cool, steady blue. Together, they greeted each delegation with the precise, graceful formality that the Silurian court had perfected over millennia. Ethan stood at the far edge of the hall. He had been assigned there deliberately, behind a row of decorative pillars, near a service entrance, where he could see very little and be seen by no one. The message was clear. He was a footnote, a name on a guest list that no one would read. But Ethan had not stayed where he was assigned. Over the past 3 days, he had studied every angle of the hall. He had identified the blind spots in the guard formation, places where the tall Silurian pillars blocked sight lines, where the crowd density would slow response times, where the ceremonial positioning of the royal guard prioritized appearance over function. He had marked these on his datapad. He had planned for something he hoped would never happen. Now, as the gala began, he moved quietly from his assigned position. He drifted along the edge of the crowd, keeping to the shadows of the pillars, until he reached a spot near a service corridor on the left side of the dais, a corridor that connected to the kitchens and was staffed by servers moving in and out. It was a vulnerability. He had written about it twice. No one had listened. He stood there, his back to the wall, and watched. The evening progressed. Music played, a haunting, underwater melody produced by Silurian instruments that vibrated through the water-saturated air. Speeches were given. Toasts were raised. The mood was one of cautious celebration. The treaty was close. After years of negotiation, humanity was about to be granted real standing in the conquered, and Queen Valeth's support had made it possible. Ethan did not listen to the speeches. He watched the crowd. He watched the servers moving between tables. He watched the perimeter guards, nodding their rotation timing. He watched the Varkith delegation, seated at the far end of the hall, their reptilian faces unreadable, their dark eyes reflecting the bioluminescent light like polished stones. And then he saw it. A figure near the neutral delegation's table, a tall, lean being in the gray robes of a Dholvari aide. Ethan had seen this individual earlier in the evening and had felt something wrong, a feeling he couldn't name. Now, watching closely, he understood. The figure's hands were wrong. Dholvari had 4-fingered hands with webbed joints. This being's hands were 5-fingered, with sharp, scaled knuckles barely hidden beneath thin gloves. Varkith hands. Ethan's heart began to pound. He looked at the guard positions. The nearest Royal Guard officer was 40 feet from the dais, moving through the crowd on a patrol loop. The ceremonial guards flanking the Queen were positioned for display. They carried ritual weapons, not combat gear. The closest combat-ready guard was behind the dais, facing the wrong direction. The figure in gray robes was moving, slowly, casually, drifting through the crowd toward the dais, toward the princess. Ethan pushed off the wall. He began walking, not running, not yet cutting through the crowd at an angle, keeping the figure in his peripheral vision. His mind was doing math he didn't consciously control. Distance, speed, time. The figure was 30 feet from the princess. Ethan was 40. The nearest guard was too far. Then the air shimmered. The figure's gray robes fell away like smoke, and the phase cloak dissolved, revealing a Varkith assassin in lightweight combat armor. The crowd around the dais gasped and stumbled backward. In the assassin's hands was a disruption lance, a long, angular weapon that hummed with a frequency Ethan could feel in his teeth. The weapon was pointed at Princess Elindra. Ethan ran. He did not think. He did not calculate. Every hour of training, every drill, every reflex that had been hammered into his body over years of service ignited at once, and he moved. The crowd blurred around him. He heard shouting, distant, muffled, like sounds heard underwater. The only thing that was clear, the only thing that existed, was the space between himself and the princess. The assassin's lance powered up. A high-pitched whine cut through the noise of the crowd, building toward discharge. Elindra turned toward the sound, her eyes wide, her bioluminescence flaring bright with shock. Ethan covered the last 10 feet in a dead sprint. He hit Elindra from the side, wrapping his arms around her and dragging her off the dais. They fell together, his body over hers, his back to the assassin, shielding her completely. The lance fired. The blast hit Ethan in the center of his back. For a moment there was no pain. There was only light, a white, searing light that consumed everything, and a sound like the universe tearing itself apart. Then the pain arrived, and it was beyond anything he had ever imagined. The disruption lance was designed to punch through Silurian bioarmor, to overload the dense biological plating that protected their vital organs. Against unprotected human flesh, it was absolute devastation. Ethan felt his back open. He felt his spine snap. He felt his lungs collapse, and then he felt nothing below his chest at all. The world went dark at the edges, and he tasted copper, and the only thing he could process was the feeling of the princess beneath him, alive, breathing, whole. He had been fast enough. The royal guard swarmed. The assassin was buried under a wall of armored bodies within seconds, the disruption lance torn from his grip and shattered. Guards surrounded the queen, weapons drawn, scanning the crowd for additional threats. The hall erupted into screaming chaos. Beneath Ethan's body, Princess Elindra was pressed against the floor, unhurt. She could feel his blood, warm, red, alien, soaking through her ceremonial silks. She could feel his heartbeat against her shoulder, rapid and weakening. She could feel his arms still locked around her, still holding, even as his body failed. "Human," she whispered, "human, let go." He couldn't hear her. His eyes were open but seeing nothing. His heart stopped for the first time as the medical team pushed through the crowd. They pulled him off the princess and laid him on the floor, and for a terrible, silent moment, everyone in the Hall of Tides saw what the disruption lance had done to a body with no armor. A Silurian medic pressed her hands to his chest and forced his heart to beat again with a pulse of bioelectric energy. It stopped a second time. She forced it again. Princess Elindra was pulled to her feet by guards. She was shaking, not from the assassin, not from the fall. She was staring at the human on the floor, at the ruin of his back, at the blood pooling beneath him, at the medics fighting to keep him alive with equipment that was never designed for his species. She couldn't understand it. He had no orders. He had no obligation. He had no armor, no shield, no biological advantage of any kind. He was the weakest person in that room by every measure the galaxy used. And he had put himself between her and death, without a single moment of hesitation. Queen Vailith reached the medical team. The lead medic looked up at her with grim eyes and said, "His injuries are catastrophic, my queen. His species is not built for this kind of damage. He will likely die within the hour." The queen looked down at the human. His face was pale and still. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths, kept moving only by the medic's hands on his sternum. Vailith's bioluminescence dimmed to almost nothing, a sign of deep, controlled fury. "Then give him too," she said. She turned to the hall. 400 delegates stood in stunned silence, watching a human bleed on the floor of the most powerful court in the galaxy. "No one leaves," the queen commanded. "Secure every exit, find out how this happened." She looked back at Ethan one final time. Then she walked toward the Varkith delegation's empty table. They had already been seized by the guard, and her light began to burn again, brighter than before, the color of fire. On the floor, Ethan Carr's heart beat on, fragile, stubborn, and refusing to stop. He should have died. Every doctor who worked on him said so afterward. The Silurian trauma pod was designed for beings with layered biological armor, redundant organ systems, and a cellular regeneration rate 3 times faster than anything the human body could produce. Ethan had none of these things. What he had was a shattered spine, destroyed muscle tissue across his entire back, 2 collapsed lungs, and a heart that had stopped 3 times before they got him onto the table. The Royal Medical Team did something they had never done before. They opened an emergency Ansible channel to Earth and connected with human trauma surgeons in real time. For 72 hours, Silurian doctors and human doctors worked together across the gulf of space, inventing solutions as they went. Synthetic spinal reconstruction using Silurian biotech adapted to human nerve tissue. cloned skin and muscle grafts grown in accelerated vats. A cocktail of medications that the Silurian pharmacologists had to design from scratch, because nothing in their medical database accounted for human biology. Ethan was in a coma for 9 days. During those 9 days, the galaxy changed. Security footage from the Hall of Tides was leaked within hours. Someone, no one ever confirmed who, released the full, unedited recording to the Concord's public information networks. It spread faster than any news story in living memory. Every species in the Concorde watched it. They watched a small, unarmored human standing near a service corridor where he had no business being. They watched him spot the assassin before anyone else. They watched him run not away, but toward the danger, covering the distance in seconds while trained Silurian warriors were still processing what was happening. They watched him tackle the princess, wrap his body around hers, and take the full blast of a disruption lance in the back. Military analysts from a dozen species broke down the footage frame by frame. They measured his reaction time. They calculated his sprint speed. They noted the angle of his body, the precise way he positioned himself to maximize coverage of the princess while exposing the largest possible area of his own back to the blast. It was not random. It was not lucky. It was trained, deliberate, and executed in under 7 seconds by a being with no genetic combat programming, no psionic danger sense, no hive mind coordination. The Rithkai, an insectoid species known for their collective intelligence, released a formal statement saying they could not explain human behavior using any existing model of individual decision-making. A being acting alone, without orders, without survival instinct engaged, without any biological imperative. It did not fit their frameworks. The Concorde had always viewed humans as minor, fragile, short-lived, unremarkable. Now, 400 million beings across dozens of star systems were watching a fragile, short-lived, unremarkable creature choose to die for someone who wasn't even his own species, and they didn't know what to do with it. On the 10th day, Ethan opened his eyes. He was in the Royal Medical Wing, the private facility reserved for the Queen's family, the most advanced medical center on Siluria. The ceiling above him glowed with soft bioluminescence, and the air was warm and humid, filtered through the ocean water that surrounded the palace. Everything smelled like salt and something faintly sweet, like flowers he couldn't name. A medical attendant was at his side immediately. She was young, her bioluminescence flickering nervously. "Sergeant Carr, you are awake. Please do not attempt to move." "The princess," he said. His voice was erect, dry, and broken. "Is she?" "Princess Elindra is unharmed. You saved her life." He closed his eyes. Something tight in his chest, something that had nothing to do with his injuries, finally released. "Good," he said. "That's good." He drifted in and out of consciousness for 2 more days. When he was finally lucid enough to hold a conversation, the first thing he asked was when he could return to duty. The attendant stared at him as if he had asked when he could fly. The human diplomatic office had already been in contact. His assignment to Siluria was being terminated, not as punishment, but as a matter of course. He was a minor attaché who had been catastrophically injured in the line of duty. He would be given a commendation, a medical discharge, and a transport home. His replacement would arrive within the month. Ethan accepted this without complaint. He asked for his personal datapad and began organizing his notes for whoever came after him. 3 days later, Queen Valeth came to see him. She arrived without ceremony, no guards, no attendants, just the Queen herself, stepping through the door of his medical suite with a quiet authority that made the room feel smaller. She was dressed simply by Silurian standards, her bioluminescence a low, steady amber that Ethan had learned indicated deep thought. She pulled a chair beside his bed and sat down. For a long moment, she simply looked at him, at the bandages, the monitoring equipment, the mechanical brace around his torso that was helping his reconstructed spine learn to hold his weight again. "Sergeant Carr," she said. "Your Majesty, I have a question for you, and I would like an honest answer, not a diplomatic one." "I'll do my best, ma'am." "Why did you do it?" He had expected this question. He had been asked it already by the medical staff, by the human diplomatic officer who had visited via holocall, by the guard who stood outside his door. Each time, he had struggled to find an answer that satisfied the person asking. "She was in danger," he said. "I was closer than anyone else. I could reach her in time, so I did." Valeth studied him. "You had no armor. You knew what that weapon would do to you." "I didn't think about it, ma'am. There wasn't time to think about it." "That," she said slowly, "is precisely what disturbs me. Among my people, an act like yours would require years of sworn devotion, a lifetime of bonded service. It would be the culmination of an entire existence dedicated to the protection of the crown. You did it on instinct, without oath, without obligation." Ethan didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. "Among my people," the Queen continued, "what you did has a name. It is called Velsurai, the Unbreakable Offering. It is the highest form of sacrifice recognized by our civilization. The last time it was invoked was 800 years ago by a Silurian noble who gave his life defending my ancestor. He was elevated to the royal house posthumously." She paused. "You are not Silurian. You are not noble. You are, by every standard my court uses, the least significant person who was in that hall, and yet you performed Velsurai as if it were the most natural thing in the world." Ethan felt uncomfortable under her gaze. "Ma'am, I appreciate the honor, but I was just doing my job." "Your job was to stand in a corner and be invisible, Sergeant. You chose something else." He couldn't argue with that. The Queen stood. "I am told your government intends to recall you, that you will be given a medal and sent home." "Yes, ma'am, standard procedure." "I am changing the procedure." She walked to the door, then turned back. Her bioluminescence shifted brighter now, the color of command. "I am invoking Velsurai formally. You will not be recalled. You will not be replaced. By royal decree, you are to remain on Siluria as a sworn shield of the crown, personal protector to Princess Elindra. It is a title that has never been held by a non-Silurian in the history of this dominion." Ethan stared at her. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I can barely walk." "You will walk again. My doctors have seen to that." "I'm not qualified for." "You were qualified the moment you chose to die for my daughter." Her voice was not angry. It was not cold. It was something deeper, the voice of a mother who had watched a stranger shield her child with his own body and had decided with absolute certainty that she would not let that man leave. "The position is not a reward, Sergeant," she said. "It is my refusal to let such a man walk away." She left, the door closed behind her. Ethan lay in the silence of the medical wing, staring at the glowing ceiling, and tried to process the fact that he had just been ordered to stay on an alien world by a queen who ruled a civilization older than human history. He thought about home. He thought about the small apartment he kept on Earth, the one with the leaking kitchen faucet he'd never fixed. He thought about his mother who would worry. He thought about the commendation he'd been promised, the quiet discharge, the simple ending. Then he thought about Princess Elindra, about the way she'd looked at him in the corridor that day, asking what one human could do. He reached for his datapad and deleted the transfer notes he'd been preparing. It seemed he wasn't going home after all. The first time Ethan stepped into the Royal Guard's training arena, every conversation stopped. The arena was built for Silurian warriors, a vast, circular chamber with a floor made of impact-absorbing coral that glowed faintly blue under pressure. The ceiling was high enough for beings over 7 feet tall to leap and swing weapons without restriction. Training dummies lined the walls, each one built to withstand the force of Silurian strikes that could shatter stone. Ethan walked in wearing a standard training uniform that hung loose on his frame and a mechanical spinal brace that hummed quietly with every step. He weighed 170 pounds. The smallest guard in the room weighed nearly 400. Lord Sathan was waiting for him. The guard commander had been ordered by the Queen to oversee Ethan's integration into the Royal Guard. He had accepted the order with the tight-jawed silence of a man forced to swallow something bitter. Now he stood in the center of the arena, surrounded by his best warriors, and looked at the human the way a sculptor might look at a block of flawed stone. "The sworn shield must pass the trial of readiness," Sathan said, loud enough for every guard to hear. "These are the standards of our order. There will be no exceptions, no modifications." The trial of readiness was a series of combat and endurance tests designed for Silurian physiology. The first test was a grappling exercise against a standard training partner, a guard named Valen who stood 7 feet 2 inches tall and had forearms thicker than Ethan's thighs. The match lasted 11 seconds. Valen pinned Ethan to the floor with one arm. The arena was silent except for the sound of Ethan's brace creaking under the pressure. He got up, he asked to go again. Valen pinned him in 9 seconds. He got up, he went again, 8 seconds. He did this 14 times before Sathan called a halt. Ethan was bruised, breathing hard and bleeding from a cut above his eye where his face had hit the coral floor. He stood at attention, swaying slightly, and said, "Again, sir." Sathan stared at him. Then he turned and walked out of the arena without a word. The guards watched Ethan limp toward the exit. Most of them felt nothing. The human was a curiosity, an embarrassment, a political appointment that would sort itself out when he inevitably quit. But one guard, a young officer named Thyra, watched the way Ethan moved and noticed something. He wasn't limping away from the fight. He was limping toward the door that led to the study rooms, where the guard kept their combat manuals and tactical archives. He wasn't giving up. He was going to study. Over the next 6 weeks, Ethan rebuilt himself. He could not match Silurian strength. He would never be able to, so he stopped trying. Instead, he began to adapt, taking the principles of Silurian combat and filtering them through everything he knew about human fighting. Where a Silurian would meet force with force, Ethan learned to redirect. Where they would block a strike with their armored forearms, he would slip beneath it and counterattack from an angle they didn't expect. He trained alone in the early mornings, before the arena opened, working through forms from Earth's martial history that the Silurians had never seen. Judo throws that used an opponent's weight against them. Close quarters combat techniques designed for tight spaces where size was a disadvantage. The dirty, efficient, ruthless fighting of a species that had spent its entire evolutionary history being smaller and weaker than almost everything trying to kill it, and had survived anyway. Thyra was the first guard to spar with him voluntarily. She was curious, she said. She wanted to understand how a being so small could keep getting up. The first time they sparred, she beat him in 30 seconds. The second time, it took her a full minute. By the third week, their matches lasted 5 minutes, and Thyra was sweating, something Silurians only did under extreme exertion. "You fight like water," she told him after one session, rubbing a bruise on her shoulder where he'd thrown her with a technique she still didn't understand. "Every time I push, you move. Every time I grab, you slip away." "Where I come from," Ethan said, "we learned a long time ago that the biggest thing in the room isn't always the most dangerous." Word spread slowly. A few more guards began showing up to spar with the human, not out of respect, not yet, but out of a growing, uncomfortable curiosity. Fighting Ethan was strange. He was weak by their standards, slow compared to their fastest, and had no natural defenses whatsoever. But he was unpredictable. He used angles and timing and misdirection in ways that their combat training had never prepared them for. And he absolutely, stubbornly, infuriatingly refused to stay down. Princess Elindra watched none of this. She had retreated from him since the Queen's decree. She attended her duties, appeared at court functions, and acknowledged Ethan's presence with the bare minimum of courtesy required by protocol. When he stood outside her chambers during his shifts, she walked past him without speaking. When he accompanied her to public events, she positioned herself as far from him as dignity allowed. Ethan didn't push. He stood where he was told to stand, did what was asked of him, and kept his mouth shut. One evening, after a particularly cold silence during a state dinner, Elindra stopped in the corridor and turned on him. "Why don't you leave?" she asked. Her bioluminescence was flickering, the Silurian equivalent of visible frustration. "You do not have to be here. This is not your world. These are not your people. You owe us nothing." "Your mother asked me to stay," Ethan said simply. "My mother gave you a title. She did not chain you to the floor. You could petition for release. She would grant it. She is not cruel." "I know she's not." "Then why are you still here?" He thought about it. "Because the job isn't done, Your Highness, and honestly, I've been through worse than you being mean to me." She blinked. Her bioluminescence stuttered, and then, for the first time, she laughed, a short, surprised sound that seemed to shock her as much as it shocked him. She didn't speak to him for the rest of the night, but the silence felt different after that, lighter. Ethan used his new access to the palace security network carefully. He reviewed sensor logs, cross-referenced personnel records, and continued the quiet work he had been doing since his first week on Siluria. The assassination attempt had been stopped, but something about it still bothered him. The sensor gap that had allowed the assassin through was too precise to be an accident. Someone inside the palace had created it. He spent weeks tracing the gap. It had been introduced through a maintenance update, buried inside a routine calibration patch, invisible unless someone was specifically looking for it. The patch had been authorized by a mid-level security technician who, when Ethan quietly investigated, turned out to have received a large sum of money from an untraceable account 3 weeks before the summit. The trail didn't end there. It led deeper, into the palace supply chains, into the guards' own communication protocols, into the scheduling systems that determined which guards were posted where and when. Someone had been manipulating the entire security apparatus from the inside, creating small vulnerabilities that individually meant nothing, but together formed a path straight to the princess. And then, during a ceremonial meal, Ethan caught a second attempt. He noticed it not through combat, but through his senses. A servant's hands trembling slightly as she poured a ceremonial drink for Elindra. A faint chemical smell that shouldn't have been there, something bitter and sharp beneath the sweet fragrance of the Silurian wine. Humans, it turned out, could detect certain chemical compounds that Silurian olfactory systems couldn't, a biological accident that, in this moment, saved a life. Ethan stepped forward, took the cup from Elindra's hand before it reached her lips, and said quietly, "Your Highness, I believe this needs to be tested." The cup contained a neurotoxin that would have killed her within minutes. The servant was arrested. The toxin was traced back through a chain that ran directly through Lord Sathan's own security protocols, channels he had personally vetted, staff he had personally approved. When Sathan was informed, his silver eyes went wide. For the first time since Ethan had known him, the guard commander looked shaken. That night, Elindra came to Ethan's quarters. She didn't knock. She simply opened the door and stood in the entrance, her bioluminescence low and unsteady. "Are you afraid?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment. "Yes." "Of what?" "Of not being fast enough next time." She stepped inside and sat on the chair by his desk. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence was not cold this time. It was the silence of two people beginning to understand each other. "Why do you stay?" she asked again, but the question was different now. Softer, real. "Being afraid and leaving are two different decisions," he said. "I made mine." She nodded slowly. Then she stood and walked to the door. Before she left, she paused and said without turning around, "Thank you for the cup." The door closed behind her. Ethan sat in the quiet of his room and thought about trembling hands and bitter smells and trails that led deeper than anyone wanted to look. The conspiracy was not over, it was growing, and somewhere at its center, he was beginning to suspect, was someone no one in the palace would want to believe. Ethan found the truth at 3 in the morning, sitting alone in his quarters with a cold cup of coffee and 6 weeks of security data spread across his datapad. The conspiracy ran through the palace like roots through soil, invisible on the surface, deeply embedded underneath. Every vulnerability, every manipulated patrol schedule, every compromised staff member traced back through a single point of origin: Lord Sathan's personal authorization codes. At first, Ethan had assumed the guard commander was simply negligent. Sathan was arrogant, certainly. He had dismissed Ethan's warnings, ignored his reports, and treated him with open contempt. But negligence didn't explain the pattern. The manipulations were too precise, too coordinated. Someone was using Sathan's codes deliberately, and the only person with unrestricted access to those codes was Sathan himself. Ethan brought his findings to the 3 guards he trusted most, Thyra and 2 officers who had earned his respect over months of shared training. They reviewed the data together in Thyra's quarters, and when they finished, Thyra's bioluminescence had gone pale. "This is treason," she said quietly. "If you are wrong, presenting this will end your life here. If you are right." "If I'm right, then the princess is in danger from the man who's supposed to protect her." He brought the evidence directly to Queen Vailith the following morning. She reviewed it in silence, her face unreadable, her light dimming to almost nothing. When she finished, she looked at him and said only, "How long?" "Months at minimum, possibly since before I arrived. The assassination at the summit was the visible part. Everything else has been happening in the dark." "And his motive?" "I believe he sees the human treaty and my presence here as a corruption of Silurian purity. He wants to replace Princess Elindra with someone from a cadet branch of the royal line who will align with Varkith interests and undo everything you've built." The queen was still for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was steady, but Ethan could see the faint tremor in her hands. "The treaty signing is tomorrow evening. He will move then." "Yes, ma'am, I believe he will." "What do you need?" "Time and your trust." She gave him both. The treaty signing ceremony was held in the Hall of Tides, the same chamber where Ethan had nearly died months earlier. The symbolism was deliberate. Queen Vailith wanted the galaxy to see that her court was unbroken, that the Silurian dominion would not be shaken by assassins or traitors. Ethan stood at his post beside Princess Elindra, not at the edge of the room, not behind the pillars, at her side where the sworn shield belonged. The ceremony began at sunset. Delegates from across the Concord gathered once more. The treaty documents were presented, formal, physical copies on traditional Silurian parchment, because some things were too important for digital records. Speeches were given. The Queen spoke about progress, cooperation, and the future. Ethan watched Lord Sathan. The guard commander stood at his command position behind the dais, directing his officers through subtle hand signals. He appeared calm, professional, in control. But Ethan noticed the small things, the way Sathan's eyes moved too quickly between guard positions, the way his hand rested near his personal communicator, the way certain guards had shifted from their assigned posts over the past hour, drifting toward doorways and control points. It happened at exactly 9 minutes past the hour. The palace lights died. Not all of them. The emergency bioluminescence in the walls kept the corridors from going completely dark, but the main systems went down, plunging the Hall of Tides into a blue-gray twilight. The communication grid followed. Then the door locks cycled, sealing some doors, opening others, reshaping the palace's architecture into a trap. Sathan's voice rang out in the sudden chaos. "Guard Protocol 7. Secure the Queen, secure the heir. All units to defensive positions. Half the guards moved to obey. The other half, Sathan's half, drew weapons. Ethan grabbed Elindra's arm. "With me, now." She didn't argue. She didn't hesitate. She moved with him as he pulled her off the dais and through a side entrance, a service corridor that connected to the kitchens, the same corridor he had identified as a vulnerability on his very first survey of the hall months ago. He knew every turn, every junction, every maintenance hatch. He had walked these passages 100 times when no one was watching, memorizing them out of habit and stubbornness and a refusal to be useless. Behind them, the Hall of Tides erupted into violence. Loyal guards clashed with Sathan's faction. The sound of energy weapons and breaking coral echoed through the corridors. Ethan led Elindra through the service tunnels at a run. His spinal brace ached with every step, but it held. They reached the fortified safe room, a reinforced chamber deep in the palace interior, designed to withstand a direct orbital bombardment. He punched in the access code, and the door began to cycle open. "Get inside," he said. "Lock it behind you. Don't open it for anyone until you hear your mother's voice." "What about you?" "I'll be right here." She looked at him. In the dim bioluminescent light, her eyes were bright and fierce, and he could see something in them that hadn't been there before, not gratitude, not pity, but recognition. She saw him clearly, perhaps for the first time. "Don't die," she said. "I'll do my best." She stepped inside. The door began to close. Footsteps echoed from the corridor behind him. Ethan turned. Lord Sathan emerged from the shadows with 6 elite guards at his back, the best fighters in the royal guard, fully armored, weapons drawn. In the narrow corridor, their bioluminescence cast harsh, flickering light across the walls. Sathan stopped 10 feet away. His expression was not angry, it was almost sad. "Step aside, human," he said. "This is a Silurian matter. You have no place in it. Walk away and I will allow you to return to your people. You have my word." Ethan drew his sidearm, a standard-issue human plasma pistol, small and almost absurd in the face of 6 armored giants. His spinal brace hummed as he squared his shoulders. "I was part of this the moment I hit the floor with your princess under me," he said. "You want her, come through me. Again." Sathan closed his eyes briefly. Then he gave the order. They came at him in pairs because the corridor was too narrow for more. That was the first thing Ethan had counted on. In an open space, 6 Silurian warriors against 1 human was a death sentence. In a corridor barely wide enough for 2 of them to stand side by side, their size became a disadvantage. They blocked each other, restricted each other's movement, couldn't use their full reach. Ethan fought the way humans had always fought when outmatched. He fought dirty. He dropped low under the first swing, fired his sidearm into the gap between armor plates at the lead guard's knee, and rolled sideways as the warrior buckled. The second guard lunged, and Ethan redirected the strike into the wall using a judo throw that sent 300 pounds of armored alien crashing into the coral. He scrambled back, fired twice more, and caught the third guard in the shoulder joint. They kept coming. He couldn't stop them, he could only slow them by seconds, trade space for time. A fist caught him in the ribs and he felt 2 of them crack. An armored elbow struck his left arm and he heard the bone snap. He fell, rolled, got back up. Sathan watched from the rear, his expression unreadable. Ethan was bleeding from a dozen wounds. His brace was cracked, sparking intermittently. His broken arm hung useless at his side. But he was still standing in front of that door, and every time a guard pushed forward, he pushed back with his pistol, his fists, his body, whatever he had left. 4 minutes and 37 seconds. That was how long he held the corridor before the Loyalist forces, alerted by the signal Ethan had triggered on a hidden transmitter before the fighting started, stormed through the adjacent maintenance shaft and hit Sathan's squad from behind. Thyra led the charge. The corridor became a crush of armored bodies, and in the chaos, Sathan was disarmed and forced to his knees. It was over. Ethan was found leaning against the safe room door, conscious but barely. 3 broken ribs, a fractured arm, deep cuts across his chest and face, and a spinal brace that was held together by a single functioning servo. He was covered in his own blood and the bioluminescent fluid of the guards he'd fought. The safe room door opened behind him, and Elindra stepped out. She looked at the carnage in the corridor, at the fallen guards, the cracked walls, the scorch marks from plasma fire, and then she looked at Ethan. He managed a smile. "Told you, we just bruise easy." She didn't laugh. She knelt beside him and pressed her hand against TH.